For the first time in over 40 episodes, we finally got a glimpse into Emilia's true potential. It was such an astounding display of power that even Echidna couldn't help but comment on how Pandora was completely outmatched by it. But with such an immense affinity for magic, there also came the issue of not being able to control it, resulting in an outburst of mana on a scale that we've only ever seen once before. So let's take a look at that plus all the other excluded details as we go through the cut content for this episode. Let's begin. Episode 44, The Eternal Freezing of the Great Elior Forest, covering chapters 4 and 5 from volume 14 of the light novel. Starting from the end of last episode, Pandora's initial encounter with Emilia put a significant emphasis on her excitement. There was a genuine expression of joy that could be seen on her face when Emilia said that she was going to open the seal. She looked as if she could barely contain her impatience anymore. It was a far different look from what we'd seen from her in the earlier encounters. On the other hand, Emilia's mind began to empty as she became overcome by feelings of fear and despair, eventually getting to the point where she was willing to use just about anything to escape the predicament she was in. So, when Pandora gave her exactly what she was looking for, Emilia was able to easily accept what should have been nothing more than an incomprehensible statement. I mean, there wasn't really much else she could do other than try to make sense of the words Pandora gave her. So, that's exactly what she did. Now, one interesting thing to note about when Emilia produced the key was that Pandora mentioned how there were likely only 2 people in the world that could hold it. Unlike in the anime, this implies that there's one other person besides Emilia who possesses the proper qualifications to even see it. It's a particular detail that I think alludes to something bigger, which is probably why it didn't make it into the anime. In any case, there was something about the key that really seemed to resonate with Emilia. It was as if she already knew exactly what it was meant for. Not only that, but just holding the key was an experience that felt very natural to her. It felt like an object that she'd used many times before, almost like it was something she could have been using to open up her own bedroom. Contrary to how Emilia felt though, it was quite obvious that the seal hadn't been opened in a very long time. Even the novels went so far as to describe it as this object that has been carrying out a long duty. So we can only imagine how much of that time Pandora has spent trying to open it. As Emilia hesitated to do just that though, we get to the point where she was then offered the 2 choices of different hopes. To the right was the hope that kept her promise, and to the left was the hope that broke it. Emilia was free to choose whichever one she thought was best. The decision itself was much harder for her than what we were shown though. The entire time she was thinking about it, her very sense of self was degrading into nothing but her consciousness alone. The sound around her was slowly dissipating from her ears, and any color she could see was fading itself out of perception. The only thing that remained was the single thought of how she was unable to choose. Eventually she did come to a conclusion though, an answer that was guided solely by the teachings of her mother. That alone was the only hope she ever needed. So it was with those teachings in mind that Emilia chose the hand on the right. And when she did, she became surprised by Pandora's apparent acceptance of her decision. I mean, Pandora definitely could have used her power to force Emilia to do as she asked. But the very fact that she didn't showed that there must have been at least a little bit of goodness deep within her. What this really was though was nothing more than a compassionate facade. Yes, Pandora was going to respect Emilia's decision, but that didn't mean that she was going to respect anything else. She had absolutely no problems with destroying anything she personally didn't find valuable or worthy of respect. So that pretty much meant the entire forest. Because Emilia was one of the people she was fond of though, Pandora had actually acted in a way that looked as if she intended to protect her. You see, when Fortuna appeared from the forest and launched her attack, she wasn't yet aware that Emilia was there as well. So it was very possible that Emilia could have been caught in the crossfire had Pandora not stepped up like how she did. The novel doesn't explicitly say that this was her intent, but it does make the implication. Anyway, the anime did a really good job adapting Pandora's death montage. They were pretty much as graphic as the novel described them to be. Then, the following moments between Emilia and Fortuna were identical as well. Where the anime starts to leave out a couple details is after Juice mistakenly attacks Fortuna. The strike itself felt inherently different from the ones he's tried to give before. That's why he was so sure that this was the time his attack finally went through. As Emilia stumbled over to where her mother's body now lay, the first thing she tried to do was keep Fortuna's silver hair clean. She wanted to keep it as pretty and unblemished as it always was. But the pool of blood that was spreading into the ends of it was preventing that from happening. It also didn't help that Emilia's fingers were covered with blood as well. The more she tried to brush the blood away, the more blotched Fortuna's hair would become as the action just served to spread it even more. Now, when Juice came to the realization of who it was he really struck, the sheer shock of it caused him to dig his fingernails straight into his cheeks. He then dragged those same fingers down his face with so much force that not only did it gouge out his flesh, but it also stripped the nails right off his fingers. His whole face was now covered in blood as he slowly succumbed to the madness instilled by the incompatible witch factor. The only reason he'd been able to maintain his sanity for so long was simply due to his own indomitable will. But now that the most important thing keeping that willpower intact was gone, so too was his ability to maintain himself and the deadly sin inside him. So this was the moment when the person that was Juice disappeared forever. What remained was simply the broken mind of a being obsessed by love. Switching back to Emilia, there were several thoughts going through her head as she held her dying mother. The first was the upsetting feeling that came with the realization of how much lighter she'd become. You see, so much blood had spilled from the initial wound that there wasn't much left to continue leaking from her body. But the very fact the bleeding had stopped only went to make Emilia think that perhaps the wound was healing. She couldn't help but wonder if this was a sign that her mother was getting better now. As the only thing to come from Fortuna was her steady flow of tears, Emilia tried her best to gather them up as she believed them to be the only thing remaining of her mother's life force. But the more she watched this unfamiliar sight of her mother shed tears and cry for forgiveness, the more she came to realize that the light had already faded from her eyes. She now understood that Fortuna could neither see, hear, nor feel anything around her. She wasn't even able to acknowledge the fact that Emilia was the person holding her. If teardrops truly did carry the power of life like how Emilia believed though, then it was most definitely her own that brought about what could only be considered a miracle. I mean, Fortuna coming back to her senses was something that should have been impossible. So perhaps it really was Emilia's tears that made it happen. Perhaps this really was what allowed them to be able to share that one final moment together. Because Fortuna could now acknowledge that Emilia was there, it made for the moment she lost her life to become that much more apparent. Emilia could immediately tell when it happened because her mother's body got even lighter. She knew that something that should never come out had now left forever. It was after Pandora came to request that the seal be opened again that Emilia finally started to make sense of everything. She was now beginning to understand exactly why the demon in front of her had acted the way that she did. Once everything had been pieced together, she was able to see that Pandora had acted with the sole purpose of getting her to break her promise. That was the only reason behind her mother's death and everything else. It's a revelation that leads us into Pandora's second death montage. But before we get into this display of Emilia's true power, there was one final thing that Pandora revealed that served to send Emilia over the edge. And that was the involvement of the lesser spirits she so fondly called fairies. Right in front of Emilia's eyes, Pandora had summoned the very same spirits that Emilia had used to find the seal. At first, Emilia was confused as to why they were now on Pandora's side. But the truth of the matter was that they were never on her side to begin with. You see, Pandora had ordered the lesser spirits to help Emilia find the seal. They didn't exactly force her to go there, but they did help in persuading her that doing so would be a good idea. So this entire time Emilia was pretty much being manipulated. As she tried to come to terms with what that meant, she also prepared herself for the rampage she was about to go on, starting it off with the sculpture of ice and death that we saw in the anime. The next was the stakes of ice that pinned each of Pandora's limbs to the ground, and that was followed by a barrage of attacks from both below and above that would shatter her body into pieces. As for the rest of it, well, that was pretty much as we saw. Every subsequent fatality was becoming more violently creative than the last. But every time Emilia activated one of these icy spells of death, her body would get closer and closer to its limits. So she was basically casting magic that her body wasn't capable of supporting, making it so that every spell only went to strain herself more and more. What exactly was happening though was that Emilia was taking in mana at a rate beyond what she could handle. Yes, this did allow her to attack with significant power and speed, but these attacks weren't enough to completely expel all the mana she was taking in. If you've ever seen the Memory Snow OVA, then you'd know that this is a state similar to the one that we saw Puck in. You see, despite Emilia or Puck's very high capacity for mana, they do have some sort of limit to the amount they can carry. And it's when they reach that limit that the mana starts to leak from their body in a form of magic. That's why the mansion became frozen in the OVA, and it's why the forest was becoming frozen right here and now. Even Pandora couldn't help but acknowledge Emilia's innate ability. She commented on both her capacity for mana and gate that could manage it. But what was even more interesting was the line that came after. A statement that all but confirmed Emilia's lineage as the daughter of a witch. Though it was a comment that Emilia herself couldn't understand, she still went on to reject it just like how she was doing with every other part of Pandora. The result was an even more uncontrollable outburst of mana. A veritable snowstorm that was increasing in strength with every passing second, eventually reaching a level of power that would cover the entire forest in a layer of permanent ice. Now, to give context as to what exactly Pandora did to Emilia here, she basically used her power to make it so that Emilia would forget her very existence. It was an action that caused all of Emilia's memories to begin rearranging themselves, almost like pages of a book were being torn out then reinserted in areas that didn't belong. What remained at the end was a mind full of inconsistencies that Emilia couldn't even begin to wrap her head around. The love she'd been granted her entire life was slowly starting to vanish, and what was emerging in its place was this inexplicable feeling of fear and looming sense of guilt. That said, there was one thing that remained clear in her memory after everything was done, and that was the fact that she kept her promise. She didn't know what the promise was for or who it was with, but she was well aware that she didn't break it. So this was the last thing she could hold on to as the ice slowly overtook her body, leaving her in a frozen sleep that would span for exactly 100 years. As the novel goes on to state, it was a century-long slumber that would only end after a certain spirit would find her. A spirit who had received life for the sake of only her. A spirit whose existence was dedicated to finding this girl. Until that time would come though, Emilia would remain here alone in this icy landscape of her own creation. In the post-trial discussion, Echidna had a little bit more to say about the person she identified as the Witch of Vanity. It would seem that she carried quite a bit of disdain towards her. The first thing she noted was how Pandora had used her ability to rewrite phenomena to change Emilia's memories, basically confirming that that's what the Authority of Vanity did. Though it was definitely a noteworthy ability, Echidna personally found it to be quite distasteful. She despised everything about it and the person who possessed it. What's even more interesting than that though was Echidna's comparison of Emilia's power to Pandora's. According to her, Emilia's younger self was far stronger than Pandora in pretty much every way. And that was because Pandora's ability was a bad matchup against Emilia's strengths. There was a significant disparity in terms of raw power that made Pandora unable to beat Emilia. Now, after Emilia had accepted the fact that she was the reason for this frozen forest, she also came to understand why it was she'd spent every day talking to the statues of ice. She now knew that it was out of a subconscious feeling of guilt that made her want to atone for her sins. When it came time for Emilia to give her answer to the trial, most of the back and forth with Echidna was pretty much the same. Emilia declared with all her heart that she was going to create the ideal world that her mother envisioned for everyone. After she was done though, Echidna began to compare Emilia to the likes of her mother. Not the one that had cared for her as she was growing up though. Instead she was talking about the one that Emilia had never met before. You see, all the harsh words that she'd just used to describe Emilia were the exact same ones that she'd used to describe her real mother. So it was in that regard that she found the two of them to be very similar. As you'd expect, this sudden topic of Emilia's mother went to catch Emilia by surprise, leading her to ask Echidna if she truly did know her real mother. It was a question to which Echidna replied saying that she did. Not only that, but she also said that the reason she gets so emotional when talking to Emilia is partly due to the relationship she had with her mother. There was something about her envious attitude that Echidna wasn't entirely fond of. This was the last thing the two discussed before parting ways at the end of the trial. In the moments after Emilia awoke in the tomb, the carving she put her hand over was the one that said "I love you." But the exact character her face landed on when she began to shed her tears was the one that stood for love. Now, the only reason she hadn't let all this emotion out before was because she refused to allow Echidna to see her cry anymore. Pure stubbornness alone allowed her to suppress her emotions until she was by herself. She also didn't want to show weakness to any of the others either. So this was the only opportunity she would have to mourn her mother's memory. Anyway, that was everything regarding Emilia's trial. The rest of the episode then skips ahead to after the truth of Sanctuary is revealed. But since that's a part of the story that still hasn't been shown yet, I can't really talk about it until that part is finished in the next episode. So all the parts dealing with the past of Sanctuary will be covered next week. Until then though, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!